Let's start with you first of all. Why do you think the Home Secretary's plans will succeed where previous plans that seem very similar to a lot of critics haven't?
I think a lot of time has been taken when it comes to the drafting of this bill. I think the wording of it, the way it's framed, I think is very clear what the government are intending from this bill, and if it goes through Parliament, what Parliament are intending from this bill. So I think that I'm hopeful it's less vulnerable to legal challenge from the Nationality and Borders Act.
But do you think it'll work?
Yes, I mean, I think if it works as intended, it will work, and I think it will provide a deterrent. And I think it's necessary. You know, I hear from my constituents all the time how angry and frustrated they are about these small boat crossings, and I think a deterrent is vital, and I think this would provide it.
Nia, it's that deterrent element, isn't it, which is the thing that the government thinks is crucial to this bill, perhaps less so than the nuts and bolts. Why do you think it won't work?
Well, I think the problem is that there has been an abject failure by the Tory government to tackle the problem, and it's got to be multifaceted how you tackle the problem. We've said, for example, strengthening the cross-border policing. That's really important. We're getting better agreements with safe countries. We had a Dublin agreement when we were in the EU. We don't have that now. We need a proper agreement so that people coming from safe countries can be safely returned. We also, as we've called for months now, need to make sure that people from Albania go back because it is a safe country. But we also need genuine safe routes which work. We know there are people who tragically were left in Afghanistan in the scramble there was back in August 2021 who are still unable to get out. Although there's supposed to be a process, that process is not working. And we need to get those safe routes set up, as well as, of course, tackling the criminal gangs, prosecuting them. Many of them actually live in the UK and could be prosecuted. Again, a failure by government. And, of course, tackling the backlog. 160,000 applications needing to be processed. People at the taxpayers' expense in hotels when they could actually be paying tax and contributing to our economy if it's deemed that they are appropriate to stay here.
David, the SNP were pretty scathing of the government's plans yesterday in Parliament. What about Labour's? Would you back those?
Well, I think part of the problem here is that everybody talks about stopping the boats, but actually what I'd like to see is let's stop the dog whistle politics here. Let's make sure that we've got safe and legal routes so that people can come here. I think one of the other questions that I would have is the fact that we've got legislation that is clearly not compatible with international law. It trashes the Refugee Convention, it trashes the international law. And I think what we need to do is get those safe and legal routes in place and actually look at the fact that Suella Braverman was on this very channel this morning talking about some of the logistical challenges that come from this legislation. Let's be honest, this legislation is all about creating a wedge issue for the next election. It's about pitting people against each other, and actually what it's about doing is targeting some of the most vulnerable people on the face of this planet, people who are fleeing war, famine, sexual violence. It's International Women's Day today, and what we're talking about is pathetic legislation that is cruel, is inhumane. Scotland is a country that welcomes refugees, not dog whistle politics that we see from the two main parties here at Westminster.
Tom, do you think that that is a fair criticism in the sense of the tone of this announcement? There were comments made in the Commons yesterday about the language that is being used. Do you think the government should be framing this slightly differently? Well,
I mean, they've got to communicate what they're bringing forward, and they've communicated the merits of the bill they brought forward. I haven't seen any dog whistle politics in Parliament that I'm aware of. When it comes to the safe and legal routes, what's really interesting is it appears that both opposition parties would be uncapped. Because we're going to put a cap on the number of refugees that we have as a country. I think that the Labour Party oppose that cap. It's also interesting to know that it would appear that the Labour Party now support an amnesty for illegal immigrants. I think that's quite interesting. It's also his point about
amnesty for illegal immigrants. Sounds a bit like dog
it's also
exactly
well, they are.
Dog whistle politics.
They've come here illegally.
Sorry,
they're illegal immigrants. They've come here illegally. They're illegal immigrants.
There's no such thing as an illegal asylum seeker and an illegal refugee.
They've come here illegally from a safe country.
Do you just agree that there's no such thing as an illegal refugee?
You said they're fleeing persecution. They're fleeing France. They've been through multiple safe European countries where they've refused to claim asylum.
Is there such a thing as an illegal refugee, Tom?
There's an illegal immigrant.
So there's no illegal refugees.
But they're not.
Just clear on that.
But they're not refugees. They're coming from France. But we're talking about illegal immigrants here.
But I think the point about dog whistle politics is that yesterday we heard far more time being spent trying to denigrate Labour and denigrate Labour's policies instead of actually explaining what the government's
your
policies
government in waiting. I don't think it's unreasonable for us to ask questions.
I think
you're the opposition party. You want to be in government.
Quite
it's
frankly,
not unreasonable for us to ask questions.
Not in the needless way like you've just done now. In the way
needless way.
The needless way in the sense that you've tried to denigrate anything to do with us and anything that we do or say, rather than actually concentrating on what you're doing, because let's be honest, Prime Minister's questions, too many times it turns into some slanging match from Sunak rather than answering the questions when it should be the Tories answering the questions.
So we don't get involved in it so much. Tom, the point that both Nia and David made is that the government hasn't really set out safe and clear legal routes, and you know, the Home Secretary, were she to talk to any of the refugee organisations, they would all say that for them is the key issue. And we saw government committees that have examined this issue say to the government, actually, it's safe and legal that is the key issue in terms of getting people here safely. What is the government doing about that?
Well, actually, when you look at the numbers of refugees we've taken as a country over the last few years, I think there's been impressive numbers. But I think the key thing is here, a lot of these organisations calling for safe and legal routes, they don't support any kind of cap. So effectively, it would be anyone who wants to move here and claims to be a refugee is able to move here. There's a limit to how many we can take.
There's a difference between having no cap and not letting anyone in through safe and legal routes, isn't there? And that, I think, is...
There are safe and legal routes. I mean, look at how many refugees have come to this country from Hong Kong, from Ukraine,
22 from Afghanistan
Syria,
in the last year.
But in
22.
total, but how many have come from Afghanistan over the last few years? Huge numbers have come from Afghanistan in the last few years.
22 in the last year, Tom.
But we're talking about the last few years. I mean, do you know how many have come from Afghanistan in the last few years?
This is the country
I'd like to see more,
routes.
frankly, because what we're seeing in Afghanistan is an increasingly worrying humanitarian situation. And for your party to sit here in the Palace of Westminster and use refugees as some sort of political football for the next general election is frankly despicable. These are vulnerable people. Scotland welcomes refugees, and we don't want anything to do with this
Actually, the numbers of Scottish councils welcoming refugees actually isn't very good.
With the greatest respect, Tom, as a Glasgow MP, I have the highest number of asylum seekers in the whole of the city.
Scotland.
So I will take no lectures from a Conservative about welcoming refugees.
It's factual.
Seekers in the whole country, doesn't it, in the UK?
Because refugees enrich our society. We should not be using them as a political football.
But the point here, because I've been attacked for questioning Labour's policy on this. But you know, I think most of the people in this country want to have controlled immigration. At the moment, you've got a leader who's on record when he was a lawyer saying that all immigration law has undercurrents of racism. I think it's legitimate for the public to know that, right? You want to be in government. Why am I unable to question the Labour Party's position on this? Of course I'll talk about the bill. I've spoken about the bill extensively.
I think you're conflating lots of different things. You're conflating the issue of refugees, you're conflating the issue of managed migration in terms of, you know, the economy. You've got business leaders calling out for certain job skills, which we don't have. So they're totally different issues.
If somebody would like to move here, to work here, that's great that they want to do that. They should engage with our points-based legal immigration system. They shouldn't arrive here illegally and expect to stay here.
The Home Office is an absolute disaster. As somebody who deals with casework every day with the Home Office, the backlogs that are in place.
I think it's
how on earth does somebody come here when the Home Office have this bureaucracy in place? That's what business leaders are saying. That's why your party's tanking in the polls.
You're giving me the impression that you actually have no problem with these illegal crossings and actually you think they should be encouraged.
Scotland's problem has never been immigration, it's been immigration. And frankly, with a Conservative government in control of immigration policy, it continues to hinder the economy.
David, Nia and Tom, we're going to pause it there. I sense that we're not going to get any agreement on this issue between the three of you, but thank you very much for exploring some of those points. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, is here with me. And Sam, it was passionate and emotional in the Commons yesterday, and we're seeing it here again in the studio now. This is something that people care very, very clearly about and very deeply about. It's likely that the Prime Minister will be challenged on this.
Or to put it another way, if you don't want a slangy match, you're probably tuned into the wrong channel. I think just the tone of the debate that you just heard, I think, underlines how people feel. But if I could urge viewers to sort of focus on one thing in this Prime Minister's questions. A lot of the discussion is about issues of principle, and people take different views. But the most interesting question for me is about practicality. Is this legislation going to hit the statute books? Are these new laws going to come in anytime soon? Does the Home Office have the capacity to deal with the extraordinary extra workload that seems to be being thrown their way? And it's a department that has had, shall we say, some problems over time. And then if people are going to be removed from this country at pace, at speed and at volume, are we going to have the deals in place to make it possible to take them back quite what's going to happen with the... I thought the language around whether or not Rwanda flights are going to start again, very fudgy from the government yesterday. It's not clear quite the approach they're going to be taking in relation to what Strasbourg said, whether they feel they can go ahead with those. So I think there's quite a lot of questions of detail and practicality. Now, Prime Minister's questions is not always the moment where you see great policy details unearthed, but let's see how Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer does.
On his feet, isn't it?
Mandatory pay gap reporting and the landmark Domestic Abuse Act. And internationally, we have launched today a new women and girls strategy, which puts them at the heart of everything that we do. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Richard Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 100 days ago, the Prime Minister promised to publish his tax returns. He still hasn't. People want transparency in our politics, especially because the Prime Minister is the richest Prime Minister in history and because of the concerns there have been. So why on earth hasn't the Prime Minister published his tax returns yet? When will he do so? And when he does so, will he include his US tax returns?
Mr. Speaker, as I previously confirmed, I will publish my tax returns, and that will be done very shortly.
Mr. Speaker, on International Women's Day, can I congratulate the Prime Minister on all the work that has been done on the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative and ensure that the UK continues to show its global leadership. Mr. Speaker, there are 250,000 people in this country living on park home sites. They are treated as second-class citizens by councils, where they pay council tax. They are treated poorly by managers who own the sites, and they are at a disadvantage to when we roll out our incredibly generous energy schemes. Can the Prime Minister ensure that we can actually give them more support and more help and reform the Homes Act?
My honourable friend is right that there is still more work to do to tackle problems with the sector. We are making progress in implementing changes, Mr. Speaker. Park owners' rights are now codified in writing with the site owner, and should those obligations not be met, residents can take site owners to a tribunal. Local authorities also now have powers to take enforcement action, and we will continue to support them to improve protection for park home residents everywhere.
Now comes the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And today, on International Women's Day, we celebrate the successes of women in our society. It's a crying shame that as we do so, we face legislation which drives a coach and horses through our world-leading modern slavery framework, which protects women from exploitation. Mr. Speaker, in the last decade, this government has introduced 5 plans to tackle illegal immigration, 5 utter failures. The problem just gets worse with every new gimmick. The Home Secretary says the public are sick of tough talk and inadequate action. Does he agree with her assessment of this government's record?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what the honourable gentleman fails to recognise that there is a global migration problem. We are not alone in facing these challenges, and it is precisely because that across Europe the numbers escalating to the extent they are, we have brought forward new plans, because we are determined, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that this remains a compassionate and generous country, that is done fairly and legally. That's why we will break the criminal gangs, Mr. Speaker. We've announced new agreements with Albania and France, tougher immigration enforcement, and now new legislation that makes it clear that if you come here illegally, you will be detained and swiftly removed. But, Mr. Speaker, what we haven't heard is the honourable gentleman's plan. We know what it is. It's open-door immigration and unlimited asylum. Whilst he may be on the side of the people smugglers, we're on the side of the British people.
Mr. Speaker, if he was serious about stopping the boats, he'd actually steal our plan on stopping the boats, smash the gangs, sort out the returns, and clean up the utter mess. Mr. Speaker.
I'm going to hear this, and nobody's going to... I wouldn't if I were you. But I think we've heard enough. I want to hear the questions and the answers, and it won't be interrupted.
Mr. Speaker, nobody on this side of the House wants open borders. On that side, they've lost control of the borders. He's promised the country that this bill will stop all small boat crossings. No ifs, no buts. Sounds like more talk. So in the interest of adequate action, when will he achieve that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we'll be implementing this plan as soon as we can pass it through Parliament. So I look forward to the honourable gentleman's support. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, on this issue, the honourable gentleman has been on the wrong side of this.
Prime Minister, Mr. Stafford, if you don't want to hear him, you can go and have a good cup of tea, nice and strong, I suspect. But I will hear him, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman has been on the wrong side of this issue his entire career. He described all immigration law as racist. He said it was a mistake to control immigration. And he has never, ever voted for tougher asylum laws. It is clear, Mr. Speaker, while he's in hock to the open border activists, we're on the side of the British people.
Mr. Speaker, when I was in charge of prosecutions, I extradited countless rapists, and the conviction rate for people smuggling was twice what it is today. I voted against his legislation last time because I said it wouldn't work. Since it became law, the numbers have gone up. He's proved me right. He should be apologising, not gloating. The Prime Minister says they will detain people who aren't eligible to claim asylum here and then return them. Well, they already tried that under the last legislation. Last year, 18,000 people were deemed ineligible to apply for asylum. That's the easy bit, the talk. But as for the action, Prime Minister, how many of them have actually been returned?
Mr. Speaker, as a result of the plans we brought forward, we have almost doubled the number of people returned this year. But he talked about laws. He talked about.
I think the front bench needs to be a little quieter because I want to hear, and I don't need you joining in. Our constituents want to hear the importance of Prime Minister's questions, both the questions and the answers. Show our constituents the respect they're due. Come on, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he asked about arrests. He asked about our laws. Actually, when I was in Dover yesterday talking to our law enforcement officials, what did they tell me? Precisely because of the law that the Conservative government passed last year, they have now been able to arrest more than double the number of people they did before. 397 in the last 6 months. But stopping the boats, Mr. Speaker, stopping the boats is not just my priority, it is the people's priority. But his position on this is clear. He wanted to, in his words, scrap the Rwanda deal. He voted against measures to deport foreign criminals, Mr. Speaker, and he even argued against deportation flights. Well, and we know why, because on this matter, he talked about his legal background. He's just another lefty lawyer standing in our way.
We'll continue. When you keep shouting, it prolongs, and some of you are trying to catch my eye. When you're disappointed, I don't want any complaints. Let's get through these questions so we might get some backbenching.
Mr. Speaker, all that nonsense because he doesn't want to answer the question. Because he knows what the answer is. The number is 21. I thought he was a man of detail. 21 people out of the 18,000. And what happens to the rest? They sit in hotels and digs for months on end at the taxpayers' expense. Last year, he promised to end the hotel farce. That's the talk. But because of his mess, there are thousands of people who can't claim asylum and can't be returned. So where does he actually think they're going to end up?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about the pressure on our asylum system. Right? We've actually got a clear plan to stop people coming here in the first place. Mr. Speaker, Labour have absolutely no plan on this issue because they simply don't want to tackle the problem. We introduced tougher sentences for people smugglers. They opposed it. We signed a deal with Rwanda. They opposed it. We are deporting foreign offenders as we speak. They oppose it.
Hold on. I'm going to say to the member from Hull, save that good voice for the rugby match. You might be able to join Mr Stafford over that strong cup of tea. Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, in fact, he opposed every single step of what we've done to try and stop this problem. In fact, his only contribution to this debate, well, we know what it is. In his own words, what did he say? We will defend free movement. That's the Labour Party for you, Mr Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr Speaker, he stood there last year saying exactly the same thing. We said it wouldn't work. They passed the law. The numbers went up. Absolutely deluded. He can't say where they'll return people because they spent 140 million on Rwanda and it doesn't work. They can't say how they'll return people because this bill doesn't come with a single new return agreement. And they can't say when they'll fix the mess because it's more talk, more gimmicks, more promises to be broken. Now, a few months ago, I put to him that of the people who arrived on small boats, only 4% had been processed. He stood there and said, that's unacceptable. What's the number now?
Mr Speaker, as a result of what we've done, there are now 6,000 fewer people in the caseload of asylum backlog. We're hiring more caseworkers. We're increasing their productivity. And again, he's mistaken when it comes to returns, Mr Speaker, because we do have returns agreements with India, with Pakistan, with Serbia, with Nigeria, and crucially, now with Albania, where we are returning hundreds of people, Mr Speaker. But look, our position on this is clear. If you arrive here illegally, you will not be able to claim asylum here. You will not be able to access the modern slavery system, and you will not be able to make spurious human rights claims. That is the right thing to do. But he's going on and on about process, hiding behind process, because he doesn't want to confront the substance. We are the party of fairness, and he represents the party of free movement.
I thought he was supposed to be the man of detail. He's gone to all that lengths to avoid the detail. He knows the answer to the question. Less than 1% of those arrived by boats have been processed. He shakes his head. It's the government's own statistic. On his watch, processing of those boat cases has gone from unacceptable, in his words, to almost non-existent. And doesn't that tell you everything you need to know? After 13 years, small boat crossings higher than ever, claims unprocessed, the taxpayer paying for hotel rooms, criminal gangs running all the way laughing to the bank, and an asylum system utterly broken on his watch. This is their 5th Prime Minister, their 6th immigration plan, their 7th Home Secretary, and after all this time, all they offer is the same old gimmicks and empty promises. Now, I don't agree with the Home Secretary on very much, but when she says that the Tories are all talk and no action, she's spot on, isn't she?
Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, illegal immigration enforcement up. The amount of people processing claims up. The backlog is down. The number of returns agreements is up. Hundreds of people returned to Albania, and now new laws to detain and deter illegal migrants. It's clear what we stand for, Mr Speaker. We're doing what's right. We are acting with compassion. We are acting with fairness, and we are acting to respect the laws and borders of our country. We are delivering what we said, and it's crystal clear here listening to this, Mr Speaker, that it's going to be the Conservatives and only the Conservatives that stop the boats.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Graphic lessons on oral sex, how to choke your partner safely, and 72 genders. This is what passes for relationships and sex education in British schools. Across the country, children are being subjected to lessons that are age-inappropriate, extreme, sexualising and inaccurate, often using resources from unregulated organisations that are actively campaigning to undermine parents. This is not a victory for equality, it is a catastrophe for childhood. Will my right honourable friend honour his commitment to end inappropriate sex education by commissioning an independent inquiry into the nature and extent of this safeguarding scandal?
Can I say I share my honourable friend's concerns and thank her for her work in this area. That's why I've asked the Department for Education to ensure that schools are not teaching inappropriate or contested content in RSHE. Our priority should always be the safety and well-being of children, and schools should also make curriculum content and materials available to parents. As a result of all of this, we are bringing forward a review of RSHE statutory guidance, and we'll start our consultation as soon as possible.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, on International Women's Day, can I ask the Prime Minister to reconfirm that under his proposed new asylum laws, a woman who is sex trafficked to the UK on a small boat by a criminal gang will not be afforded protection under our modern slavery laws?
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely because we want to target our compassion and our resources on the world's most vulnerable people that we must get a grip of this system and break.
Can I just say to the SNP, it's quite right, the questions are asked, but I also want to hear the answers. Shouting from up there is not helping anybody. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, it's precisely because we want to target our resources and our compassion on the world's most vulnerable people that we need to get a grip of this system, make sure that we have control over our borders, make sure our system and resources are not overwhelmed so that we can help the people most in need. There is nothing fair, there is nothing compassionate about sustaining a system where, as we saw recently, people are dying on these crossings. That is not right, and our plans will stop that from happening.
Mr. MacDonald, I don't need to hear you chunnering all the way through. You can be joining the others for a cup of tea. Come on, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I'll take that as a yes from the Prime Minister that women who are the victims of sex trafficking will not be protected under our modern slavery laws. What a complete and utter disgrace, Mr. Speaker. But whilst it may shock, it shouldn't necessarily surprise, because this is the Tory government that in recent months has spoken of invasions. Just yesterday, this was the Tory government that said that 100 million people could be coming to these shores. And this is the Tory government that this morning said that number could in fact be billions. Complete and utter nonsense. So may I ask the Prime Minister, from whom are his government taking inspiration? Nigel Farage or Enoch Powell?
Mr. Speaker. And what a load of nonsense, Mr. Speaker. What a load of nonsense. No, in fact, the figure of 100 million, it doesn't come from the government. It comes from the United Nations, Mr. Speaker. And it illustrates the scale of the global migration crisis that the world is grappling with, which is why it is right that we take action, Mr. Speaker. Because if we do not, the numbers will continue to grow. They have more than quadrupled in just 2 years. It's a sign of what is to come, and our system will continue to be overwhelmed. And if that happens, we will not be able to help the people who are most in need of our support, our generosity, and our compassion. This has always been the way of this country, and once we get a grip of this system, that's who we can extend our support to, and that's why it's the right legislation.
Lip down.
Last year, the UK economy grew at the fastest rate in the G7 of 4.1%, while at the same time, greenhouse gas emissions fell by 3.4%, more than comparable countries. To maintain this momentum ahead of the net zero strategy refresh, will he encourage my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, to use his budget statement next week to stimulate investment in renewable energy projects by renewable energy companies, both offshore and onshore, to improve our energy security, reduce reliance on more expensive fossil fuels and ultimately reduce bills for households?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of our commitment to scaling up renewable energy sources. Renewables make up now nearly 40% of our electricity supply, a fourfold increase since 2011. My honourable friend will know that I cannot and will not preempt budget decisions, but he is a powerful champion for the environment in this House, and I've no doubt that he'll make his views known to the Chancellor.
Ed Davey.
Joining the tributes on International Women's Day and pay a special tribute to the women in this House, past and present, who helped shape the future of our country. Mr. Speaker, when Jean rang 999, she was told she would have to wait at least 8 hours for an ambulance. So she got in her car and drove herself to Eastbourne District General Hospital. She paid for parking and made it to the entrance of A&E, where she collapsed. Jean died an hour later. Mr. Speaker, no one should lose their mother or grandmother like that. So will the Prime Minister apologise to Jean's family and to all those who've lost loved ones due to the government's appalling ambulance delays? Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, my thoughts and condolences go to Jean and Jean's family for what's happened. It's absolutely right that we continue to make progress on improving the performance in urgent emergency care. We outlined plans to do this just the other month, and I'm pleased to say that we are seeing performance improve, whether it's waits in A&E or ambulance performance times, a considerably marked improvement over the last several weeks compared to the peak pressures that we saw over the winter due to COVID and flu. And because of the investments we're putting in more ambulances, more doctors and nurses, and more discharge, I'm confident that we will continue to make progress to getting the care that we all expect and need to see.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since its release earlier this year, the heartwarming and inspiring story of Dave Fishwith's journey to set up a community bank has quickly risen to be one of Netflix's top films. Last week in the Chamber, I called for more initiatives, such as the Bank of Dave, to support local communities across the UK. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that financial inclusion is an essential part of levelling up opportunities in our communities? And will he meet with me and Dave to discuss how we can replicate his success story in other areas such as Stoke-on-Trent?
Well, Mr. Speaker, community-focused banks and non-bank lenders, like the Burnley Savings and Loans, have a vital role to play in ensuring that everyone can access affordable credit. That's why we've made it quicker and easier for new banks to enter the market, and the new bank startup unit was created several years ago, and now 30 new banks have been authorised. I will ensure that my honourable friend gets the meeting with the Exchequer Secretary to discuss this issue further.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. BBC Radio 4's You and Yours have exposed queue-jumping online touts who've been buying up Eurovision tickets and putting them on sale for thousands of pounds on dodgy sites like Viagogo. In this year, when we are hosting Eurovision on behalf of war-ravaged Ukraine, this latest example of rampant rip-off culture in Tory Britain is particularly despicable. Why hasn't his government done more to support? Why hasn't his government done more to support genuine fans over the rip-off merchants, the spivs, and the ticket touts?
Well, Mr. Speaker, actually, we will continue. We have put in place measures to combat ticket touting. I'm happy to look at the documentary that he mentioned and make sure that we're doing everything we can do, and I'll talk to the Home Secretary about it. But more generally, it is a source of enormous pride for us to host Eurovision. I know it's something that everyone is looking forward to, and we should ensure that there is the broadest possible access to seeing that, and we'll do everything we can to make sure that that happens.
David Davis.
Mr. Speaker, in the aftermath of 9/11, the British government signed an extradition treaty with the United States with the intention of covering terrorism and violent crime. Since it came into force in 2003, the US has extradited 83 people to the UK. We've sent 225 to America, and 3/4 of those have been for non-violent and largely white-collar alleged crimes. There's a fundamental unfairness at the heart of our extradition treaty, and it was shown by the fact that Anna Sakoulas refused to come to face trial for the killing of Harry Dunn. The unfair treaty is compounded by an American system which coerces British citizens and gives them an unfair trial. In the last 2 decades, the American policy has been rather like an international commercial policy. Correcting this is important. Will the Prime Minister look at this treaty with a view to correcting this parity of justice?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. Obviously, it's in our national interest to have effective extradition relationships, and under the treaty we have with the US, we've secured the extradition and subsequent conviction of terrorists, murderers, rapists, and child sex offenders. I'm happy to meet with him to discuss this issue further. As he knows, the US has refused, I think, one UK extradition, and the US
US has refused 1 UK extradition request and the UK has refused 27, but I know that he has concerns and I'd be happy to meet him to discuss this further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a stark correlation between areas off the gas grid and those with the highest rates of fuel poverty. It's worse in Scotland, ironically, in those areas closest to the national gas reserves in the North Sea, but also in urban deprived areas where multi-storey flats are deprived of the ability of having natural gas. Being off the gas grid means that you're dependent on currently unregulated fuels such as heating oil that have risen faster than electricity and gas, or being dependent upon old and inefficient and very costly all-electric systems. Will the Prime Minister end this by ensuring that all fuels are regulated, and also by ensuring that these households that are all-electric are able to get the alternative fuel payment?
Mr. Speaker, as someone who represents a rural constituency with many people off gas grid, I appreciate the concern the honourable gentleman raises, but that's why that's always been uppermost in the government's mind as we've designed and implemented our support for people with energy bills, notably doing that based on electricity meters rather than gas, but also putting in place the alternative fuel support payment of £200, and we're making sure that that gets to everyone who needs it.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, the adjustments to the dental contract last November were a very welcome step, but there is more work to do. Will the Prime Minister therefore keep this area under the very closest review to ensure that constituents such as mine in South Norfolk and those of other honourable members get the best possible dental care?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises an excellent point, and I can tell him that we are continuing to invest in NHS dentistry, £3 billion a year, but we've also enabled practices to do 10% more activity on top of their contracts and remove the barriers so that hygienists and other therapists can continue to work to their full skill set. The number of NHS dentists has increased by about 500 over last year, and we'll continue to work with the sector to see what more we can do.
Rosie Duffield.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As today is International Women's Day, does the Prime Minister agree with me that voters in the run-up to May's local elections have every right to ask candidates who are standing for a position of responsibility in local government questions relating to women's rights? And does he believe that as representatives of their political parties, all candidates must answer those questions honestly, politely and with respect while standing on a voter's doorstep?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady makes an excellent point, and I wholeheartedly agree with her. These are important questions. Voters deserve to have clear and straightforward answers to them, and I hope that she can continue to put her campaign forward. She'll have my full support, and I hope in the local elections we can debate these issues in the way that they should be.
Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last weekend, I had the pleasure of being auctioned off for the Conservative Women's Organisation. No returns. On this International Women's Day, will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to the excellent work the CWO do to get more women, Conservative women, into politics, and paying tribute to all the remarkable women who support us in the work we do, especially because she's in the gallery, my mum.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate, first of all, my honourable friend for his successful auction? I assume it wasn't his mother that bid for him successfully, but also pay tribute to her, but also pay tribute to the work of the Conservative Women's Organisation for the fantastic work they do. We need more women standing in local and national politics, and everyone who is working to bring that about deserves our praise and thanks, and long may it continue.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On today's International Women's Day, research published by pensions company Scottish Widows has shown that a woman retiring today would have to work to the age of 81 to achieve a pension fund parity with her male counterpart. And as everybody is worrying, a woman in the workplace today, aged 25, can still expect to retire with a pension fund £100,000 on average lesser than her male counterparts. Yeah. With all of the fiscal and social policy levers at his disposal, can the Prime Minister tell us how he is going to set a course to shut that gap over what remains of his premiership?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government takes the issue of the gender pensions gap incredibly seriously, and we've delivered groundbreaking pension reforms and major progress. Automatic enrolment has in fact helped millions more women save into the pension, and pensions participation among eligible women in the private sector was 87% in the last available year, up from just 40% a few years ago. And we remain committed to the measures in the 2017 review and will continue to give this issue all the attention it deserves until we can close the gap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Grimsby Town Football Club has reached the quarter-finals of the FA Cup. The last time the team achieved that was in 1939, which by coincidence was the previous time that the town had a Conservative MP. Now I know that Grimsby beat the Prime Minister's team of Southampton to get to this next stage, but would he join with me in congratulating the team and wishing them best of luck when they play against Brighton and Hove Albion in the next stage?
Mr. Speaker, it pains me, although I will say congratulations to the Honourable Lady and Grimsby for their victory over Southampton, and I now have a new team to support in the Cup, and she'll have my full support. I wish them well against their next match and look forward to cheering her and all her colleagues on.
Steve McKay. Mr. Speaker, I've heard the Prime Minister talk fondly about helping out in his mum's community pharmacy. How will we feel if 600 of them close this year because of a vicious NHS contract which takes no account of rising costs and is forcing many into bankruptcy?
Mr. Speaker, I praise the work that our community pharmacies do. They're fantastic at being on the front line of delivering primary care. And as I've said previously, the government is exploring ways in which we can support them to do even more, because I think improving access to pharmacies is something that people would both welcome and would help people get the care that they need faster and more efficiently. And we'll continue to look at all the proposals that have been given to us.
Kelly Thomas.
For more than 2 years, an illegal waste site has been operating in the village of Borstal. Tipper lorries covering their number plates as they thunder onto the site at all hours of the day and night, blighting the lives of the residents that live directly by and creating untold environmental damage. I thank the DEFRA team for their engagement with the Environment Agency so far, but no action has been taken. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that enough is enough and swift multi-agency action should be taken to stop and shut down illegal and criminal activity such as this?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend for raising this issue? The government is committed to tackling waste crime, and the Joint Unit for Waste Crime brings together agencies in the way that she described. I am aware she's met the local Environment Agency director about this particular issue, but I will also ensure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss this further.
Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my constituent Ollie Stevens was just 13 years old when he was stabbed and brutally murdered in a local park just yards from his home. The two boys who attacked him had shared dozens of pictures of knives online before the attack. So could the Prime Minister explain to me why the government's removed measures to tackle this sort of dreadful online content from the Online Safety Bill?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the case that the honourable gentleman raises. My thoughts are with Ollie's family. He's absolutely right that we should do everything we can to tackle the scourge of knife crime, and that's why, for instance, this government brought forward new powers to improve the police's use of stop and search, which has made a major difference, and actually violent crime is now down considerably over the past few years. The Online Safety Bill also goes further than any other country has gone to make sure that we are protecting children online. I'm happy to look at the specific issue that he mentions, but it's been praised by the Children's Commissioner and others for being a groundbreaking law that will do wonders to improve children's safety.
Daniel Cutchins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State for DEFRA will be visiting Shrewsbury at the end of this month at my invitation, and she will hear the tremendous progress to date from the River Severn Partnership and the Environment Agency that we are working to try to find a holistic solution to managing Britain's longest river, the River Severn. We are now experiencing flooding in Shrewsbury on an annual basis, with tremendous economic damage as a result. Will he take an interest, please, and secure additional funding for DEFRA so that we can finally tame these rivers and protect our communities from annual flooding?
This is an issue that my honourable friend has raised before, and he's right to do so. The government has doubled flooding, double investment in flood defences over this Parliament to £5.2 billion. I know the DEFRA Secretary will have her visit, we'll talk to him and his communities, and I look forward to hearing back from her after that.
Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Between 1997 and 2010, Labour governments across the UK lifted 800,000 children out of poverty. Yet, since 2010, the Conservatives have driven 500,000 children into poverty, with child poverty next year predicted to reach levels not seen since the 1990s. There is not enough parliamentary time this year for the Prime Minister to say sorry to each child damaged by their policies. But could the Prime Minister start today by saying sorry for all the children that he failed during this time?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the exact stats are since 2010 there are 1.2 million fewer people in poverty than there were, and that's because of the actions that this Conservative government has been putting in place, like raising the national living wage, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, the best way to ensure that children, especially, do not grow up in poverty is to ensure that they are not growing up in a workless household. And as a result of the actions of this government in getting people into work, there are now several thousand fewer workless households than in 2010.
Natalie Alford.
It was a great pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister to Dover to talk about the work he's undertaking on the pull factors to tackle illegal immigration. The Prime Minister has a meeting upcoming with President Macron this week. Could I ask him to see what more can be done to deal with the push factors of illegal migration around small boats, particularly pushing those boats across French beaches and pushing those boats from French beaches into the French Sea?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, there is no single lever that will solve this problem, which is right that we work on all the different things that will make a difference, including close cooperation with the French. That's why I was pleased at the end of last year the Home Secretary and I announced the largest ever small boats deal with France, 40% increase in patrols, greater cooperation, and we look forward to strengthening that cooperation and furthering that discussion this Friday.
Imran Hussain.
Mr. Speaker, let us be absolutely clear in this chamber. Under this government's new dystopian, far-right, appeasing, anti-refugee bill, those who were trafficked to the UK would still face deportation. Can the Prime Minister therefore clear up whether Sir Mo Farah, who last year bravely revealed that he was trafficked to the UK as a child, would have been removed under this bill?
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely because that we do want to help the world's most vulnerable people that we've got to stop our system being exploited and overwhelmed by illegal migrants who are being trafficked here by criminal gangs. There is nothing compassionate, there is nothing fair about supporting that system continuing, and that's why our new laws are the right way to deal with this, and I hope that he can see that and support them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning on International Women's Day, I joined some of the amazing young women at Our Lady of Lourdes School in Leigh-on-Sea to take part in the FA's Let Girls Play Football. Does my right honourable friend agree that sport, and football in particular, is a brilliant way to empower young women? And would he visit Southend and celebrate some of our aspiring lionesses?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. I wholeheartedly agree with her. Hopefully I can come and visit her. She's right about the power of sport to both engage young women but also to inspire others. I'm looking forward to seeing the lionesses later today, and the government is pleased to announce today more funding and more support for sport in schools, which I hope she will warmly welcome.
Final question, Tahir Ali.
Mr. Speaker, on International Women's Day, it is vital we talk about women in Indian-occupied Kashmir being subjected to rape, domestic abuse, kidnapping, forced marriage and torture
by the Prime Minister's Moody's extremist BJP-led government. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the BJP government have exploited women through gender-based violence? And does he agree that the UK government should be standing in solidarity with Kashmiri women?
Speaker, this government has a proud record of standing up for women and girls across the world. We have led the way in preventing sexual violence in conflict, and we're taking a lead on ensuring tens of millions of girls receive the high-quality education that they deserve in some of the poorest parts of the world. And just today, we have announced a new women and girls strategy from the Foreign Office and backed that up with £200 million more to support women's health around the world. And that continues our leadership on this issue, which will remain the case.
Well, that's the end of Prime Minister's questions. A little bit of breaking news before we dissect it with Sam Coates. We've been hearing in the last few minutes that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's daughter, Princess Lilibet Diana, has been christened last Friday by the Archbishop of Los Angeles. It's the first time that the daughter they refer to as Lily has been publicly referred to as Princess, and she became a princess when her grandfather, the King, acceded to the throne. So, lots to chew over with Prime Minister's questions, and our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, is here in the studio. Sam, migration was expected to dominate, and it certainly did.
That's right, Jane. I actually thought it was a fascinating PMQs, not because of the facts that were unearthed during it about migration. Most of those, if you've been paying attention to the government announcement yesterday, are sort of broadly in the public domain. But we sort of learnt a lot about how politics around this issue is going to be conducted. And I thought it was really interesting just to observe the different approaches of the two-party leaders. So what Rishi Sunak was doing was trying to emphasise the principles here. He was trying to mine the divisions between the Conservative position, as outlined by him and the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, over the last 48 hours, and the Labour position, which is slightly less distinct in certain ways. So Rishi Sunak did policy. Keir Starmer did process. He tried to focus on whether the plans were deliverable. He sidestepped really what he agreed with and what he didn't agree with, and instead he focused on whether Whitehall was fit for purpose, whether the government had a good track record on delivering these kind of policies in the past, and whether or not in practice it's all going to work out. Now, that wasn't the only route he could have gone down. If you listen to the SNP Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, he attacked Rishi Sunak on the basis of policy. He suggested that a woman who had been trafficked, came over on a small boat, would be subject to immediate deportation and never be allowed to claim asylum in this country. And he suggested that the principle was unfair, but instead Keir Starmer went all on whether or not this was going to make any practical difference. So just hear a bit of Keir Starmer.
After 13 years, small boat crossings higher than ever, claims unprocessed, the taxpayer paying for hotel rooms, criminal gangs running all the way laughing to the bank, and an asylum system utterly broken on his watch. This is their 5th Prime Minister, their 6th immigration plan, their 7th Home Secretary, and after all this time, all they offer is the same old gimmicks and empty promises. I don't agree with the Home Secretary on very much, but when she says that the Tories are all talk and no action, she's spot on, isn't she?
So you had a number of facts that Keir Starmer wheeled out, 4% of claims processed. Now that's down to less than 1%. And I think he highlighted the number of people who have been returned under the previous asylum system that the government had run. So that was Keir Starmer's plan of attack. Rishi Sunak's, well, we learnt a lot there as well. Effectively, this is going to be an election dividing line. You could tell from the way that the Prime Minister, I mean, bluntly, threw the kitchen sink at this one, trying to highlight all sorts of previous things that Keir Starmer has said about migration, basically making him out to be in favour of open borders, and then rolling out this attack line of being a lefty lawyer. I thought Rishi Sunak's contribution had all of the smell, all of the hallmarks of being carefully focus grouped, designed to try and road test some of the language that we're hearing all the way up to the election, suggesting, it has to be said, Jane, that this is as much, if not more, about politics than it is delivery, given the tight time frame between now and the next general election, given it's going to take months and months and months for the legislation to pass. Politics. Here's how Rishi Sunak threw the kitchen sink at Keir Starmer.
When I was in Dover yesterday talking to our law enforcement officials, what do they tell me? Precisely because of the law that the Conservative government passed last year, they have now been able to arrest more than double the number of people they did before. 397 in the last 6 months. But stopping the boats, Mr. Speaker, stopping the boats is not just my priority, it is the people's priority. But his position on this is clear. He wanted to, in his words, scrap the Rwanda deal. He voted against measures to deport foreign criminals, Mr. Speaker, and he even argued against deportation flights. Well, and we know why, because on this matter, he talked about his legal background. He's just another lefty lawyer standing in our way.
And I suspect we will hear that phrase, lefty lawyer, again and again on the run-up to the election. Sam, what else did we learn at PMQs?
A couple of issues that emerged on the side. Most strikingly, a Conservative MP, Miriam Cates, asked the Prime Minister on International Women's Day about whether or not all schools were teaching, or some schools were teaching, inappropriate information or including graphic descriptions of oral sex as part of sex education lessons. And the Prime Minister actually said that he's asked the Department for Education to ensure that children are not getting information that is not age appropriate. So it sounds like there's been an announcement of a decision of a government action that we didn't know about in relation to sex education lessons.
He said they're bringing forward a review on PSHE. So.
And so something to watch, therefore, interesting what's behind that, what evidence they have and what action is going to be taken about that. And also right at the start of Prime Minister's questions, in response to a question from Richard Bergen, the left-wing Labour MP, Rishi Sunak confirmed he'll be releasing his tax returns soon. So that's one to watch for.
One for Donald Trump to watch as well, perhaps. Thanks very much, Sam. Now, Ukraine has denied reports that it was behind the Nord Stream pipeline attack after US intelligence suggested a pro-Kiev group was responsible. Russia has repeatedly denied involvement in the incident last year and blamed the West, as America and NATO called the incident an act of sabotage.
For me, it's a little bit strange story because this story is nothing with us. And I think that investigation of official authorities will describe every details, because it's like a compliment for our special forces, but this is not our activity.
More on this, I'm joined by our defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clark, who's in our other glass box studio. And Michael, this Nord Stream mystery does seem to be rolling on, doesn't it? Have we learnt much more today?
Not really, Jane. I mean, I think the story rests on only sort of two threads, quite thin threads, really. One is that there's lots of investigations going on. So the UN is investigating, European governments are investigating this explosion, and the United States is investigating it. And one part of one of the US investigations was leaked, apparently, to the New York Times. The New York Times is running with it, saying that this was a bit of private enterprise on behalf of apparently some Ukrainian or possibly Russian dissidents. There's a bit more of a strong thread with Die Zeit, the German Die Zeit, and ARD in Germany, are reporting that a group with false passports chartered a boat in Poland, sailed it to Rostock, then to Christiansee Island, which is near where the explosions happened, and they had divers on board, 6 of them. They had 2 divers, 2 assistants, whatever they're supposed to do. And when the boat came back and was handed back, it was a hire boat, there were traces of explosives.